The cruelest thing about betrayal is that it rarely comes from strangers. The courtroom felt colder than the December air outside. Pale winter sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across polished wooden benches and the marble floor beneath them. Every seat was occupied. Attorneys shuffled papers. Reporters whispered quietly near the back row. Members of the Bennett family sat together on one side of the room, dressed in expensive suits and dark designer coats, their confidence almost visible in the way they carried themselves. At the center of it all stood Claire Bennett, alone. Her simple gray coat looked modest compared to the luxury surrounding her. Her blonde hair rested neatly against her shoulders. Her hands remained folded calmly in front of her. She did not look frightened. She did not look angry. Yet everyone watching her seemed convinced they were witnessing the final collapse of a woman who had already lost everything. At the front of the courtroom, Judge Eleanor Whitaker reviewed the final documents. The estate dispute had lasted for months. Arguments, filings, hearings, endless legal procedures. Now it was finally reaching its conclusion. Ryan Bennett sat beside his attorney with a relaxed expression. At 38 years old, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. The Bennett family empire, built over 3 generations, was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Real estate, manufacturing, investments, private holdings, everything was at stake. And according to the family, Claire deserved none of it. Your Honor, the Bennett attorney said as he rose from his seat, the evidence clearly demonstrates that Mrs. Bennett has no legal ownership claim regarding the family assets. Several members of the Bennett family nodded immediately. One of Ryan's sisters even smiled. The attorney continued. She was married into the family, but she was never part of its ownership structure. Therefore, we respectfully request final confirmation that all disputed assets remain under Bennett family control. The room fell silent. Claire remained motionless. Across the aisle, Ryan finally looked toward her. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Once, years ago, she would have recognized warmth there. Friendship, partnership, trust. Now there was only distance. He looked away first. Judge Whitaker reviewed the final page before speaking. Based on the documents currently before this court, the petition appears legally supported. A murmur moved through the courtroom. The Bennett family exchanged relieved glances. One cousin quietly whispered, "It's over." Another smiled openly. Claire heard every word. She reacted to none of them. Ryan's mother adjusted a diamond bracelet around her wrist and leaned toward a relative. She should have accepted reality months ago. The statement was not meant to be quiet. Claire heard that too. Still, she said nothing. Because the truth was, she had spent years listening. Listening while people assumed she contributed nothing. Listening while they spoke about her as though she were invisible. Listening while they treated loyalty as weakness and kindness as dependence. The judge set down her pen. Unless there are additional filings before this court, I am prepared to issue a final ruling. The words seemed to release a wave of satisfaction through the Bennett family. Ryan leaned back in his chair. His attorney began organizing paperwork. Reporters prepared their notes. The story was ending exactly the way everyone expected. Then the rear doors of the courtroom opened. The sound echoed sharply through the silence. Every head turned. A man in a dark navy overcoat stepped inside carrying a sealed legal envelope. His expression was calm, professional, urgent. He walked directly toward the front of the courtroom. The satisfaction vanished from several faces immediately. Judge Whitaker looked up. "Sir, identify yourself." The man stopped beside the clerk's desk and removed a document from the envelope. "Your Honor," he said evenly, "my name is Daniel Mercer. I am legal counsel representing instructions left by the late William Bennett." The courtroom froze, because William Bennett had been dead for nearly 8 months. And according to everyone in that room, every document he left behind had already been found. The silence that followed seemed to drain all sound from the courtroom. Even the reporters stopped typing. Daniel Mercer stood calmly beside the clerk's desk, one hand resting on the sealed envelope, while dozens of eyes remained fixed on him. Across the room, members of the Bennett family exchanged confused looks. Ryan frowned immediately. "This is impossible," one of his cousins whispered. Another shook her head. Everything was already reviewed. Judge Whitaker adjusted her glasses and extended her hand. "Bring the documents forward." Daniel complied without hesitation. The envelope changed hands, and was delivered to the bench. The judge carefully examined the exterior seal. The courtroom waited. Nobody seemed willing to breathe too loudly. Claire remained exactly where she had been standing moments earlier. Calm, silent. Her expression revealed nothing. Yet watching the room unravel around her felt strangely familiar. Because this was not the first time people had underestimated what they did not understand. Years earlier, when she first married into the Bennett family, she had arrived with genuine hope. William Bennett, founder of the family empire, had welcomed her warmly. The rest of the family had been polite enough. At first, but politeness had a way of fading when expectations entered the room. Claire quickly learned that the Bennett family valued achievement they could see. Expensive degrees, executive titles, public recognition. She possessed none of those things. At least not publicly. While Ryan built his career inside the family business, Claire spent years helping William through declining health. She attended medical appointments, organized schedules, managed medications, read reports to him when his eyesight worsened, stayed beside him during long evenings when the rest of the family was too busy attending conferences, networking events, and social gatherings. None of it appeared on financial statements. None of it generated headlines. And because it was invisible, most of the family treated it as though it had no value. There were holidays where she prepared entire dinners only to spend the evening listening to conversations that excluded her. Family meetings where her presence was acknowledged, but her opinion never requested. Charity galas where people assumed she was simply Ryan's wife and nothing more. Claire rarely objected. William noticed. He always noticed. Sometimes after family gatherings, he would sit quietly in his study while the large grandfather clock echoed through the room. Then he would look toward her and smile sadly. One day, he once said, "People will regret confusing silence with weakness." At the time, Claire thought he was simply trying to comfort her. She never imagined those words would linger years later inside a courtroom. Back in the present, Judge Whitaker carefully opened the envelope. The crackling sound of paper seemed unusually loud. Ryan shifted forward in his seat. His attorney looked increasingly uncomfortable. Daniel remained expressionless. The judge removed several documents and began reading. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Then she looked at Daniel. Where exactly were these obtained? From instructions left directly by William Bennett, Daniel answered. Held in escrow until specific legal conditions were met. Another wave of whispers moved through the room. Ryan's mother suddenly looked pale. That cannot be right, she said under her breath. The judge continued reviewing the pages. Whatever she was reading appeared significant. The confidence that had filled the Bennett side of the courtroom only minutes earlier was beginning to disappear. Claire watched quietly. Through the tall windows, snow drifted past the courthouse outside. Soft, steady, unhurried, much like the truth itself. It did not need to rush. It arrived when it was ready. Finally, Judge Whitaker placed one document separately from the others and looked across the courtroom. Mr. Mercer, she said carefully, these papers reference an additional statement from the deceased. Daniel nodded once. Yes, Your Honor. The judge looked back down at the page. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty crossed her face. Then she spoke words that immediately tightened every muscle in Ryan Bennett's body. I believe this court needs to hear exactly what William Bennett wanted to say. Judge Whitaker lowered her eyes to the document in front of her. The courtroom remained completely silent. Outside, snow continued drifting past the tall windows, but inside, every person seemed suspended in the same moment of uncertainty. Daniel Mercer stood quietly beside the clerk's desk. Ryan Bennett sat rigid in his chair. Members of the Bennett family exchanged uneasy glances. Nobody knew exactly what was written on those pages, but everyone could feel the atmosphere changing. The judge adjusted the papers and began reading aloud. To the court, my family, and any party involved in the administration of my estate. Her voice echoed softly through the room. If this statement is being read, it means I am no longer here to speak for myself. Several heads lowered. Even now, William Bennett's name carried weight. He had built the company, expanded it, protected it through recessions, market crashes, and decades of competition. For most of the family, his word had always been final. The judge continued. For many years, I observed the people closest to me, not during public celebrations, not during business successes, but during ordinary days when nobody believed they were being watched. Ryan's mother shifted uncomfortably. The judge kept reading. Character is not revealed when life is easy. Character is revealed in sacrifice, patience, loyalty, and service. A subtle murmur moved through the room. Ryan stared toward the bench without blinking. Judge Whitaker turned another page. Some members of my family have spent years measuring value through ownership percentages, titles, and public recognition. They are free to continue doing so. I never shared that belief. Claire remained motionless. Her hands rested calmly in front of her. Her expression revealed nothing. Yet memories surfaced quietly in her mind. Early mornings bringing William breakfast before medical appointments. Long afternoons helping him review documents when his vision deteriorated. Evenings spent reading reports aloud while he sat beside the fireplace in silence. None of those moments had ever seemed important to anyone else. Apparently, they had mattered to him. The judge paused briefly before continuing. The person who demonstrated the greatest loyalty to me did not ask for money, did not seek influence, did not request recognition. In fact, she repeatedly accepted being overlooked. Ryan finally shifted in his seat. His attorney leaned toward him and whispered something. Ryan did not respond. Across the aisle, several relatives began looking toward Claire. The attention was subtle at first. Then it became impossible to ignore. Judge Whitaker continued reading. There were days when I was surrounded by family and still felt alone. During those days, one person remained beside me. Not because she had to, because she chose to. The room grew quieter still. Even the reporters had stopped writing. They listened. Everyone listened. The judge turned another page. For legal reasons, additional instructions remain sealed until certain conditions are satisfied. However, I leave this statement as evidence of my intent. Ryan's cousin swallowed visibly. His mother gripped the armrest of her chair. Daniel Mercer remained perfectly composed. The judge reached the final paragraph. I trust that the truth will eventually become visible, even to those who spent years refusing to see it. She lowered the document and looked toward Daniel. Mr. Mercer, the statement references additional sealed instructions. Yes, Your Honor. And those instructions remain valid. Completely valid. The judge glanced down at the remaining documents. Whatever she saw there caused her expression to tighten slightly. Not with concern, with concentration. Ryan noticed it immediately. Your Honor, his attorney interrupted, rising from his seat. Before proceeding further, we would like the opportunity to review these materials. You will have that opportunity, Judge Whitaker replied. But first, this court intends to determine why they were withheld. The attorney sat down again. Across the courtroom, Claire finally looked toward the bench. For the first time all afternoon, a faint expression crossed her face. Not relief, not satisfaction, something quieter, something closer to understanding. Because she remembered one final conversation with William Bennett only weeks before his death. A conversation that had ended with 6 simple words she never forgot. Wait until the truth arrives itself. And as the judge reached for the next sealed document, Claire realized that moment might finally be approaching. Judge Whitaker studied the remaining documents for several long seconds before placing them carefully on the bench. The atmosphere inside the courtroom had changed completely. Earlier, confidence had filled the Bennett side of the room. Now uncertainty sat in its place. Nobody knew exactly what was coming next, but everyone sensed that the case they believed was ending had suddenly become something else entirely. The judge looked toward Daniel Mercer. Mr. Mercer, according to these records, there are additional sealed instructions that were intentionally withheld until specific legal conditions were satisfied. That is correct, Your Honor, Daniel replied. And those conditions have now been met. Yes. The judge nodded slowly. Across the aisle, Ryan's attorney rose immediately. Your Honor, before any further action is taken, we request a complete review of all newly submitted materials. You will receive that review, Judge Whitaker said. However, this court also intends to understand why these documents were concealed from the original probate process. The attorney sat down reluctantly. Ryan remained silent. His eyes never left the folder resting on the judge's desk. Beside him, his mother clasped her hands tightly together. For the first time all afternoon, she looked worried. Daniel opened his briefcase and removed another thin envelope. Unlike the first, this one carried multiple legal certifications attached to the front. He approached the clerk and handed it over. The room watched every movement. Judge Whitaker reviewed the certifications carefully. This appears to have been executed nearly 14 months ago, she said. Correct, Daniel answered. Several months before William Bennett passed away. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Reporters immediately began writing again. 14 months. That detail alone changed everything. It meant these instructions had not been created at the last minute. They had been planned. Deliberately. Thoughtfully. Long before anyone knew how the estate dispute would unfold. Claire listened quietly. Memories surfaced once more. 14 months earlier, William had still been strong enough to spend afternoons in his study overlooking the frozen lake behind the family estate. She remembered helping him organize files one evening. The room had smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Financial reports covered the desk. He had stared out the window for a long time before speaking. Most people believe inheritance is about money, he said. Claire remembered smiling. What do you think it is about? William looked back at her. Trust. At the time she assumed he was speaking generally. Looking back now, she wondered whether the conversation had meant more than she realized. The judge broke the silence. Mr. Mercer, explain to the court why these documents were sealed. Daniel folded his hands calmly in front of him. Because William Bennett anticipated resistance. The words landed heavily. Several members of the Bennett family immediately exchanged uncomfortable looks. Resistance from whom? The judge asked. Daniel paused briefly. From individuals more interested in ownership than intent. No names were mentioned. None were necessary. The implication hung in the air. Ryan's cousin shifted nervously. His mother looked away. Even Ryan lowered his eyes momentarily. Judge Whitaker opened the second envelope and began reviewing its contents. Page after page. Her expression remained professional, but subtle changes appeared. First concentration, then surprise, then something closer to realization. The room noticed. Everyone noticed. Finally, she placed one particular document aside. This is unusual, she said quietly. Daniel nodded once. William believed extraordinary situations required extraordinary clarity. Snow continued falling beyond the courthouse windows. The gray afternoon light had begun fading, leaving the courtroom bathed in softer shadows. Time seemed to slow. The judge looked toward Claire for a brief moment before returning her attention to the page. Ryan noticed the glance immediately. So did everyone else. And for the first time since the hearing began, a question started forming in the minds of the people sitting on the Bennett side of the room. What if Claire had never been the outsider they believed she was? Judge Whitaker lifted the document and looked toward the courtroom. The next section contains instructions regarding succession. The room fell silent once again, because everyone understood that whatever happened next would determine far more than the distribution of money. It would determine who William Bennett had truly trusted when everything mattered most. Judge Whitaker held the succession document in her hands, but did not begin reading immediately. The delay seemed almost deliberate. Every person in the courtroom leaned forward slightly, waiting. The fading winter light beyond the courthouse windows cast long shadows across the floor, and the room felt smaller than it had an hour earlier. Smaller and far more fragile. Ryan Bennett stared at the document as though he could force its contents to reveal themselves through sheer determination. Beside him, his attorney flipped through legal notes with growing frustration. Nothing in the original estate filings had prepared them for this moment. Nothing had suggested additional instructions existed. Daniel Mercer stood calmly, showing no sign of concern. He looked exactly like a man who had expected this day for a very long time. Judge Whitaker finally lowered her eyes to the page. This section concerns succession authority and future control of Bennett Holdings. A ripple moved through the courtroom. Reporters immediately reached for their pens. Several family members exchanged anxious looks. The judge continued. The document states that succession should not be determined solely by blood relation, executive title, or ownership expectation. Ryan's mother visibly stiffened. The judge read on. The document further states that stewardship of the company should be entrusted to the individual who demonstrated consistent loyalty, sound judgment, and personal integrity during the final years of my life. Silence followed. Heavy silence. The kind that made every small movement sound louder than it should. Claire remained still. She looked neither hopeful nor afraid. She simply listened. The judge turned another page. Attached to these instructions are evaluations, letters, and observations recorded over a period of 3 years. That statement immediately attracted attention. 3 years. William Bennett had apparently been documenting his observations for years before his death. Ryan's attorney stood again. Your Honor, these materials require authentication before they can influence succession decisions. They have already been authenticated, Daniel answered before the judge could respond. Multiple independent certifications are included in the record. The attorney sat down slowly. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier was beginning to disappear. Judge Whitaker reviewed several additional pages. The expressions crossing her face revealed very little, yet enough. Surprise, thoughtfulness, concern. At one point she looked directly toward Ryan before returning her attention to the documents. He noticed. Everyone noticed. Then she reached a section containing handwritten notes. These appear to be personal observations made by William Bennett himself. The room became completely silent once more. The judge began reading selected passages. Observed repeated commitment without expectation of reward. She paused. Demonstrated patience under difficult circumstances. Another page. Placed family needs above personal recognition. Another page. Earned trust through actions rather than words. Each sentence felt like another stone added to an invisible scale. Across the courtroom, members of the Bennett family lowered their eyes. The descriptions sounded familiar. Too familiar. Because everyone knew who William had been describing. Claire remembered many of those days. Quiet mornings delivering reports to William's study. Long evenings helping him sort correspondence after medical treatments left him exhausted. Conversations beside the fireplace when the house had fallen silent. None of those moments had seemed extraordinary at the time. Yet apparently he had been paying attention. The judge reached the final page in the section and stopped. Her eyes remained on the document longer than before. Interesting, she said quietly. Ryan immediately leaned forward. What does it say? The judge looked up. The next instruction references a designated successor. The room froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the reporters seemed reluctant to interrupt the moment. Ryan's mother gripped the edge of her seat. His cousin stared toward the bench. Daniel remained perfectly composed. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken slightly for the first time all afternoon. Not because she knew what was written. Because she did not. William had never discussed details. He had only spoken about trust. About truth. About patience. Judge Whitaker carefully closed the folder containing the evaluation notes and placed her hand on the final sealed document. According to these instructions, she said, the identity of the designated successor is contained in the final declaration. Every eye in the courtroom shifted toward the envelope resting beneath her hand. Because everyone understood that one name, written on one page, was about to change everything. Judge Whitaker rested her hand on the final declaration for several seconds before opening it. Nobody in the courtroom seemed willing to move. The anticipation had become almost unbearable. Outside, the snowfall had intensified, covering the courthouse steps in a fresh layer of white. Inside, dozens of people waited for a single name, a single decision, a single truth. Ryan Bennett felt his pulse pounding in his ears. He told himself there was nothing to fear. He was William Bennett's son. He had worked inside Bennett Holdings for more than a decade. He knew the business. He knew the investors. He knew the family legacy. Yet confidence no longer came as easily as it had earlier that afternoon. Too many assumptions had already been shattered. Judge Whitaker carefully broke the seal. The sound echoed through the silent room. She unfolded the document and began reading. Final declaration of succession intent. Her voice remained calm and precise. Prepared by William Bennett under legal supervision and verified through independent counsel. The judge continued reading through the opening paragraphs. Legal language. Certifications. Procedural requirements. Every sentence seemed to delay the answer everyone wanted. Reporters leaned forward. Family members sat frozen. Even the attorneys had stopped taking notes. Then the judge reached the section that mattered. I have spent considerable time evaluating who should inherit responsibility for the future of Bennett Holdings. The room grew still. This decision was not based on blood relation. It was not based on title. It was not based on expectation. Ryan lowered his eyes briefly. Something about the wording felt personal. Leadership requires trust. Trust requires character. The judge turned another page. For years I observed the people closest to me. Some pursued authority. Some pursued wealth. Some pursued recognition. A long pause followed. Only one person consistently pursued none of those things. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. Around her, members of the Bennett family were no longer hiding their anxiety. Ryan's mother stared at the floor. His cousin looked toward the exit as if hoping to escape the moment entirely. Daniel Mercer remained perfectly still. Judge Whitaker continued. The individual named in this declaration demonstrated loyalty without reward, service without recognition, and integrity without supervision. Every eye in the courtroom shifted toward Claire. Nobody said her name. Nobody needed to. The room had already begun to understand. The judge reached the final page. Her expression changed slightly. Not surprise. Recognition. Then she spoke. Accordingly, I designate the following individual as my chosen successor for all controlling interests held under my authority within Bennett Holdings. The courtroom stopped breathing. Claire Bennett. No one moved. For several seconds, the words simply hung in the air. Reporters stared at their notebooks. Attorneys stared at the bench. Family members stared at Claire. Ryan stared straight ahead as if he had not heard correctly. Then reality began spreading through the room. Slowly, relentlessly. Claire Bennett. Not Ryan. Not another relative. Not a board member. Claire. The woman they had spent years treating like an outsider. The woman they had attempted to remove from the estate only hours earlier. Judge Whitaker continued reading. This designation includes controlling voting authority, succession rights, and all associated leadership responsibilities as defined under the accompanying trust structure. A reporter dropped his pen. Someone near the back of the courtroom whispered, "My God." Ryan finally turned toward Claire. His face revealed something she had never seen before. Not anger. Not resentment. Confusion. Genuine confusion. As though he was trying to reconcile two completely different versions of reality. Claire met his gaze briefly, then looked away. Because this moment did not feel like victory. It felt like understanding. William had never been choosing an heir. He had been choosing a steward. Someone he believed would protect what he built rather than simply inherit it. Judge Whitaker lowered the document and looked across the room. There are additional provisions attached to this declaration. The statement immediately captured everyone's attention again. Because if the courtroom had already been stunned by what they heard, nobody could imagine what remained hidden inside the pages that William Bennett had left behind. The words continued echoing through the courtroom long after Judge Whitaker finished reading them. Claire Bennett. Chosen successor. Controlling authority. The phrases seemed impossible to reconcile with the image the Bennett family had carried for years. Reporters hurried to capture every detail. Attorneys exchanged hurried whispers. Family members sat frozen in disbelief. Yet at the center of the storm, Claire remained exactly as she had been all afternoon. Calm, composed, silent. Ryan could not take his eyes off her. He searched her face for some sign that this had all been planned. Some indication that she had known exactly what was coming. But all he saw was the same quiet woman he had spent years overlooking. The realization unsettled him more than the declaration itself. Judge Whitaker glanced down at the remaining pages. The court will now review the attached provisions. The room settled once more. Everyone understood there was more to come. William Bennett had not left behind a simple inheritance. He had left behind a carefully constructed message. One piece at a time. The judge turned the page. Provision 1. The designated successor shall immediately assume controlling voting authority over all trust-protected holdings. Several gasps sounded from the gallery. Controlling authority. Not partial authority. Not symbolic authority. Real authority. Ryan's attorney immediately stood. Your Honor, this would fundamentally alter the governance structure of Bennett Holdings. That appears to be the intention, Judge Whitaker replied. The attorney sat down again, visibly frustrated. The judge continued. Provision 2. Existing leadership positions may remain in place only at the discretion of the designated successor. This time the reaction was even stronger. Ryan's cousin visibly paled. His mother looked toward him with growing concern. Because for the first time, everyone understood the implications. Claire would not simply inherit shares. She would inherit the ability to decide who remained inside the company and who did not. Yet even then, she showed no reaction. No satisfaction. No triumph. She listened as quietly as she always had. Daniel Mercer watched the family carefully. Years of legal practice had taught him to recognize the exact moment when people realized the future they expected no longer existed. He was witnessing that moment now. Judge Whitaker reached another section. Provision 3. A private letter addressed to the designated successor shall be released upon confirmation of succession. The judge looked toward Daniel. Do you possess this letter? Yes, Your Honor. Daniel removed a sealed envelope from his briefcase. Unlike the others, this envelope contained a handwritten name on the front. Claire Bennett. The sight of it sent another wave of silence through the room. Claire stared at the envelope. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. William had written to her. Personally. She had not known. Memories surfaced again. The final months before his passing. Long conversations near the fireplace. Quiet afternoons reviewing reports together. The afternoon he asked whether she regretted marrying into the Bennett family. She remembered her answer clearly. No. I regret that some people never learned how to see each other clearly. William had smiled at that. A sad smile. A knowing smile. Back in the courtroom, Judge Whitaker reviewed the final page of the declaration. Then she paused. Her eyes lingered on a single paragraph longer than before. There is one additional statement, she said quietly. The room leaned forward again. The declaration specifies that succession was never intended as a reward. The judge looked up. It was intended as a responsibility. Claire felt something shift inside her. Not because of the wealth. Not because of the authority. Because she suddenly understood what William had been trying to do. This had never been about choosing a winner. It had been about protecting something he loved. The company. The legacy. The future. The judge lowered the document. The court will recess briefly before reviewing the final attachments. Nobody moved. Nobody seemed willing to break the tension. Outside, snow continued falling across the city. Inside, the Bennett family sat surrounded by a truth they could no longer ignore. And waiting inside the private letter addressed to Claire was a final message from William Bennett that would explain everything. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere felt completely different from the one that had existed that morning. The confidence that once surrounded the Bennett family had vanished. In its place lingered uncertainty, disbelief, and a growing awareness that the story everyone believed they understood had never been complete. Snow pressed softly against the courthouse windows. The fading afternoon light cast pale reflections across the polished floor. Claire sat quietly at her table, the sealed letter from William Bennett resting beside her. She had not opened it. Not yet. Somehow it felt too personal for this moment. Too important. Judge Whitaker resumed her seat and reviewed the remaining documents one final time. The court will now address the final attachments included with the declaration of succession. Every person in the room listened carefully. Ryan sat motionless. His attorney no longer appeared interested in arguing. The legal foundation supporting the documents had become impossible to ignore. What remained was understanding why William had made his choice. The judge lifted a supplemental memorandum attached to the declaration. This section provides explanatory context for the succession decision. She adjusted her glasses and began reading. To those reviewing this decision, I expect some of you will question my judgment. Several members of the Bennett family lowered their eyes immediately. Some may believe I overlooked experience, blood relation, or tradition. The judge turned a page. I did not. The room remained silent. Leadership is not inherited through a last name. Leadership is earned through conduct. Claire remembered hearing similar words before. William often repeated them during private conversations. At the time, she assumed they were observations about business. Now she understood they had been something more. The judge continued. Many people assume that stewardship belongs to the person who speaks the loudest. I learned long ago that stewardship belongs to the person willing to serve when nobody is watching. Across the courtroom, Ryan slowly closed his eyes. Memory after memory surfaced. Family dinners, board meetings, holidays. Years of moments he barely noticed because they seemed ordinary. Claire organizing details no one else wanted to handle. Claire helping his father through difficult days. Claire remaining present long after everyone else had left. Things he never considered significant because they produced no immediate reward. The judge reached another section. I observed loyalty tested repeatedly. I observed ambition tested repeatedly. I observed character tested repeatedly. Her voice remained steady. Only one person remained unchanged. A reporter in the gallery stopped writing and simply listened. Claire Bennett never sought ownership. She never requested influence. She never demanded recognition. The words settled over the room. That is precisely why she earned my trust. Ryan looked toward Claire. For the first time in years, he truly saw her. Not as a spouse, not as a member of the family, not as someone standing quietly in the background. He saw the person his father had seen. Patient, steady, dependable, strong in ways that never required attention. The realization hurt more than any legal ruling could have. Judge Whitaker reached the final paragraph. If this decision surprises you, it should, because surprise often reveals how little attention we have been paying. The silence that followed felt profound. Nobody objected. Nobody argued. The truth carried too much weight. Then the judge lowered the memorandum and looked toward Daniel Mercer. Mr. Mercer, are there any remaining materials? One final item, Your Honor. Daniel opened his briefcase and removed a thin folder. William Bennett requested that these records be introduced only after succession was confirmed. The judge accepted the folder and reviewed the first page. Her expression changed immediately. Not shock, recognition. She turned another page, then another. Finally, she looked up at the courtroom. These records indicate that the succession declaration is only part of the story. A wave of confusion spread through the room. Ryan frowned. Even Claire looked surprised. Judge Whitaker closed the folder slowly. It appears William Bennett made additional arrangements long before his passing. The room froze once again, because after everything already revealed, nobody could imagine what else remained hidden. Yet judging by the expression on the judge's face, the final truth would be larger than anyone expected. The courtroom remained silent as Judge Whitaker opened the final folder William Bennett had left behind. Outside, evening had begun settling over the city. The snowfall had slowed, and the fading winter light painted the courthouse windows in shades of silver and blue. Inside, nobody seemed aware of the passing time. Every person was focused on the documents resting before the judge. Claire sat quietly with William's unopened letter in her hands. Ryan remained motionless across the aisle. The distance between them felt larger than the width of the courtroom. Judge Whitaker reviewed several pages before finally speaking. The additional arrangements referenced in the declaration concern a separate trust structure established 3 years ago. A murmur moved through the room. 3 years. Long before William's health had seriously declined. Long before any dispute existed. This had not been a last-minute decision. It had been a plan, carefully considered and deliberately executed. The judge continued. According to these records, William Bennett transferred a substantial portion of his personal holdings into an independent stewardship trust. Reporters immediately began writing again. Attorneys exchanged surprised looks. The judge turned another page. The purpose of the trust was not simply wealth preservation. It was leadership continuity. Claire listened carefully. Even she had never heard of this structure. The trust includes additional company shares, real estate interests, investment holdings, and voting authority not previously disclosed during probate proceedings. The room froze once again. Ryan's attorney looked visibly stunned. Several family members simply stared at the bench. Every revelation seemed larger than the one before it. Yet Judge Whitaker was not finished. The designated steward and sole beneficiary of that trust is Claire Bennett. No gasps followed this time. The room had already exhausted its ability to be shocked. Instead, a strange stillness settled over everyone present. The truth had become too large to deny. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. Not because of the wealth. Not because of the authority. Because she finally understood why William had spoken so often about responsibility. He had never been preparing her to receive something. He had been preparing her to protect something. Judge Whitaker closed the folder. Based on all submitted evidence, this court recognizes the validity of the succession declaration and the associated trust arrangements. Her gavel touched the bench lightly. The matter is resolved. Just like that, months of legal conflict ended. No dramatic speeches followed. No celebrations. No arguments. The truth itself had become the final verdict. People slowly began gathering their belongings. Reporters hurried toward the exits. Attorneys discussed procedural details. Members of the Bennett family remained seated longer than everyone else, as though they were struggling to understand how completely the day had changed. Ryan stood quietly. For several seconds, he simply looked at Claire. Then he crossed the aisle toward her. She turned as he approached. The noise of the courtroom seemed to fade into the background. "I did not see it," Ryan said softly. Claire held his gaze. "See what?" He glanced around the room before answering. "You." The honesty in his voice surprised even him. "All those years, I thought I understood who you were. Claire said nothing. Ryan smiled sadly. Turns out my father understood better than I did. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ryan nodded once. Not in defeat. In acceptance. Some truths arrived too late to change the past. Claire watched him walk away. There was no anger left inside her. No desire for revenge. Only clarity. Minutes later, she stepped through the courthouse doors. The cold winter air greeted her immediately. Snow covered the sidewalks and rooftops across the city. The world looked quieter somehow. Cleaner. She opened William's letter at last. Inside, only a few handwritten lines appeared. The strongest people are rarely the loudest. Thank you for proving me right. Claire read the words twice before folding the letter carefully. Around her, the city continued moving exactly as it always had. Cars passed. People hurried along the sidewalks. Life moved forward. She looked toward the horizon where the last light of day lingered beyond the buildings. Then she smiled. Not because she had won. Not because she had inherited anything. But because the truth had finally been seen. And for the first time in a very long time, she walked forward carrying nothing she needed to prove.